in an institution, and then a publication was done, I think, 20 years ago, and now the second edition has just come out, which has a lot of new information in it, and it's expanded as the collection has expanded also. The funny thing about, let me say, have you had a chance to look at the bibliography, go through it? Does it make sense to you? You haven't seen it yet. You've just got it. Oh. I can't hear. What? Thaw, T-H-A-W. Yeah. That is going to be the go-to book for just about everything. And if you find something that is not in that book, if you, in relation to our collection, funnel your question to David and I'll respond to it so that you have specific information. Pretty much everything as an object type is represented in that book. What's in our collection is in that book. Of course, our things are better, but the information is very good. I particularly liked this quote from Rick West. You had a chance to read it? It really does sum it up. Did you need it? Okay, let's take a moment. The reason that we felt that these quotes were incredibly important is that the Diker collection, which is shown at the Metropolitan, consists of historical works. I think the most recent thing was made in 1930. And we felt that it was enormously important to bring forward why these historical works are important to living Native peoples today. That they don't simply exist in the past, that they have presence and they have meaning for Native peoples and for all of us today. And I would say that I don't think these could have been written 20 years ago. I think that there is an increasing degree of reflection on the part of many Native peoples. And we've had, in the last 20 to 30 years, a number of exhibitions that have looked at Native American art from different perspectives, and all of that is beginning to, I think, make itself felt. We also have opened a new National Museum of the American Indian. I believe it was in 2004, and that was an incredibly important step. This is nice. Jolene Richard, as you can see, she's at Cornell University. She's an artist, historian, professor. She sort of does everything. And particularly like this piece. And Brian Vaio, this is his last job as director, Indian Arts Research Center in Santa Fe. This year he was elected to be governor of the Pueblo of Acoma. So he left this position in order to assume that responsibility, which will be probably for 2 years. So the next thing I want to do is to give you a brief overview of the history of the collection. And it's, how can I say this? Because we were collecting when the museum opened, which was, by the way, a very, very visionary step for the founders of the museum. I don't know that there are a few other fine arts museums in the country that began with some Native American works, but as you know, when this museum was planned, there was no collection. So the presence of Native American works in the initial collection was not something that happened by default. It was very much a part of the vision of the founders. And in that way, the Nelson-Atkins was a leading institution. And I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. So the first collecting initiative, if you'd like to think of it that way, occurred in 1931 to 33. There was the creation of an Indian room. Do any of you remember the Indian room? You do? Well, it was much beloved. It was based on the Field Museum's installations, so it had kind of a natural history look about it. There were vegas in the ceiling to bring you to the southwest. It was very, very heavy in southwestern art, blankets, pottery, some baskets. There were 2 dioramas, Maria Martinez making pottery and a Navajo woman weaving a rug. And I still have some of my older members of the Committee on Collections asking me when those dioramas are going to come back. I wanted to have one put up in my office, but it's too small. But anyway, so the founders of the museum were sending people out to acquire things, and they went to, first of all, George High at the National Museum of the American Indian. And from Mr. High, they bought 100 works. I would say 10 of them are of exhibition quality. Out of the 100, 5 are miraculously world-class masterworks. How those got into the mix, I don't know, because George High was a tough deal maker and he pretty much skinned us. The other 90 pieces are pretty marginal in quality. There were 415 pieces from the Fred Harvey Company. And as you may know, Harvey Company was based in Kansas City. There was a bit of a conflict between the curator of the Fred Harvey Company and the head of the company, who was here. The curator wanted to keep all the best stuff in the Southwest, and it was quite contentious. But anyway, we ended up with 415 pieces. Of those, about 50 were really exceptional works, mainly pottery, Pueblo pottery, of which we have some great, great pieces, and some textiles, Navajo weavings that are very, very important, some Pueblo weavings. But the rest of it was sort of filler. It was collected according to the natural history paradigm, which is an effort to represent Native culture by one example of everything. So aesthetic quality was not necessarily the most important driving factor. Rather, it was categorical, and it was based on history, and it was based on culture, and it was based on the function of objects. So what that amounts to is that only about 12% of what was brought in that early years was acquired of real quality, fit for an art museum rather than a historical museum or a natural history museum. From 34 to 2001, there was no dedicated collecting. The museum continued to acquire, mainly from gifts that were brought in. Many of them were not particularly important, but there were certain key gifts that were incredibly important. The Tenney collection came in around mid-century, around 1950, and it was largely Plains Indians, but there were also some very important Navajo weavings, so it transformed the collection to a degree. The Great Silverhorn Book of Drawings came in as a donation in 1977. Ted Coe, former director Ted, left the great Bella chair that's on view in the gallery, which is a kind of pretty much a very singular work. And then a former trustee named David Beals II left us our astonishing Pueblo jewelry, mid-century jewelry. When I was in Phoenix, I was judging at the Heard Museum, Indian Fair and Market, and I went through their galleries. And you would think the Heard Museum has everything because it does have opportunity and location and all the rest of it. But I would say that our collection is beginning to rival those in terms of masterworks. The second really transformative aspect of the collection occurred in 2001 when Donald Casey Jones gave his collection of 116 pieces. 12 of these I would regard as superb masterworks. Pretty much everything else was of significant quality, exhibitable quality, but the real gift was a bequest of $1.4 million for acquisitions. Now, American Indian art remains the cheapest art in the market. It's the best deal possible for quality works. I would say that I was telling our Committee on Collections that $1 in American Indian is worth 10 in African and 50 to 100 times that of modern and contemporary. So there were, 1.4 was a very significant resource to have to begin to build the collection at that time. It wasn't enough to do what we wanted to do, but it allowed us to really do something significant. When Mark Wilson asked me what my plan for the collection was, I said it should be small, it should be highly selective, it should be made up of real masterworks. We'll probably never have the money or the time to create historical works in great depth, but we don't need to. The old adage, a collection is remembered by its masterworks, I think is very, very true. And we have a number in the collection at this point that are pretty widely recognized as that. So the Jones collection was transformative, and it was part of what occurred. It was a confluence at the time. Mark Wilson wanted American Indian brought into a position of real prominence. He wanted it connected with American art, which I believe in very strongly. He wanted the collection to become an important collection because he also felt there was opportunity here. And then there were the donors, Morton and Estelle Sosland and Fred and Virginia Merrill, who put forward their interest and eventually their resources into the creation of the suite of galleries. And then, of course, the Sosland collection of Northwest Coast art, which made it possible for us to really present Native American art from across the continent. Before that, we couldn't do it. Northwest Coast art is the most expensive, I would say, other than Arctic, of all art in the field, pretty much. And so that gift was also transformative and extremely important. So Jones, Sosland, Merrill, and Wilson. And a department was created. I happened to be consulting for the Nelson Atkins at that time, and Mark convinced me to retire from the university that I came from and come here. I thought I was going to be here for 5 years. And we're going through a series of interviews now, and when we go around the table and talk about who we are and how long we've been here, I realize that I think I've been here longer than any other curator other than Lingon. So I'm becoming an old-timer. So the goal from the outset was to create a comprehensive collection in terms of the major forms that were created within each area. And to base that collection not on the natural history paradigm, but really to create a new gallery that would present all major forms of North American art from across the continent, pre-contact to contemporary. And I would say when I came, there was only one contemporary work in the collection, and that had come from Donald Jones. So the acquisition plan from the very beginning was very strategic. I'm going to jump over some stuff here. But just to give you a sense, there were basically prior to Joan's gift, when I came, there were no objects in the woodlands that were worth showing. There was almost no Northwest coast or Arctic. Plains had some remarkable pieces, but it was also extremely limited. There were no plateau works except for some basketry. As I said, we had strong Southwest pottery, Navajo weavings, and a smattering of other works from the Southwest that were very strong because of Fred Harvey. So it became from the outset that gifts were critical to building this collection in the way that we wanted to build it, to meet our goal. I also did a major deaccessioning, I think it was in 2006 or 7, and raised another $500,000 for new acquisitions. And my strategy there is to sell 10 common things and buy one great thing. A different curator might have done it in a different way, but that was what I felt needed to occur here. Between 2004 and 2008, when the galleries were created, money was raised roughly around $8 million. So our galleries are among, I think, the most expensive Native American galleries in the country. Many people think they're certainly among the most beautiful. But most significantly, it was 4 times more than the original plan. When we started, we thought we could do it for $2 million. And I remember that the price of steel kept going up at the same rate that we were raising money for about 5 years. And it was, anyway, we finally made the top through a transformative gift from John and Marilyn McConnell, and then Morton Soslin brought in basically the last gallery from friends of John Morgan, who was an early a trustee of the museum. But the really transformational thing was the gift of 31 Northwest Coast objects from Morton and Estelle Sosland. That simply created, it rounded out our collection, it created the need for more space. Mark Wilson was open to it, and we went from an initial plan of 2,800 square feet to 6,100 square feet. So we now have 3 galleries because of that. When the collection went on view, there were 207 pieces. And just to give you an idea of this, there were 25 from the original 1931-33 collection. There were 20 from other sources prior to 2002. There were 12 from the Jones collection. There were 25 long-term loans from regional institutions and collectors, and then about 125 things that I had acquired since 2002, so in 5 years. So I think many of the collection catalogs that you had began before there was a Department of American Indian Art. This is really a very new collection, and it is still taking form. The year following the opening of the galleries, I was invited to curate The Plains Indians by Musée de Quai Branly Lee. They probably worked on that show. It opened in Paris, came here, and then went on to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There was only one major acquisition during that time, and that was a very important gift from Lee and Joanne Lyon, formerly of Kansas City. When they agreed to gift the collection, they were still in Aspen. Lee eventually moved back to Kansas City. Maybe some of you knew him. But it was very important. It was about a $4.5 million gift. So it was very, very significant. And then about 3 years ago, kind of right at 3 years and 3 months, right at the close of the Plains Indians at the Met, both Morton Sosland and the Merrills thought that it would be a wonderful idea to do a collection catalog. We felt that the collection merited it by that time. We felt it was worth doing, and we began work on the catalog. But Morton, who many of you may know, is sort of an expert at development and raising money and simply bringing in all kinds of support for the institution, suggested that this would be kind of a perfect time to kind of bring to close all of those conversations that a curator has going all the time about potential gifts, and to really bear down on important purchases and to use the dedicated funds that have been put in place for American Indian art. So in the last 3 years, 3 months, 103 new works have been brought into the collection, valued at about $3.8 million, which is substantial for American Indian art. These came in from 33 different donors, 20 outside the Kansas City region. There were 19 acquisitions from dedicated funds and 6 purchases of critical pieces using deacquisition funds. So in just the last 3 years, the collection has also changed. And of these 103 pieces, probably 70 of them will be in the collection catalog that will probably have something like 220 to 250 works. So this collection, the information around it, and what the collection catalog we hope to produce has been very much a kind of living, developing, organic kind of thing. We hope to have the collection catalog to press by the end of this year. As I say, the 2 things have happened really. The collection has changed, and then I've become very much aware of the need for native voice within the writings that we use. I don't want to just use just native scholars as well as non-native scholars, but whenever we can have the voices of native artists, we're going to do that. We think it adds immeasurably to the understanding of the piece. You've all seen the exhibition upstairs, Reclaim, where the label copy is entirely quotes from artists. And I think that those become a very meaningful component to the more formal, the more technical information that a curator might bring. The galleries. So from the beginning, the plan was ambitious. We wanted to give American Indian art great prominence within the museum so that it was really viewed as equal to the art from around the world, that there was no hierarchy, which is often the case in America's fine arts museums. Either Native American art doesn't exist at all, or it's relegated to a marginal space, which was the case here before 2009. This is still going on. I mean, we have changed 9 years ago. The Metropolitan changed in October. The Boston Museum is considering how to better integrate Native American within Crystal Bridges is changing. The Whitney is changing. There's a lot going on in museums. However, if you read Holland Cotter's piece on the new organization, the new installation at MoMA, did any of you read that? It was in the paper, maybe I lose track of time, 3-4 weeks ago. And basically, MoMA is going to reinstall its entire collection in relation to this new edition that they're developing. And so they went down a list. It was like a litany of China, Korea, Lapland, Tibet, the South Seas, on and on and on and on. There was not a single mention of Native North American art. And I don't know that it's going to be included in the plan. I'm going to find out. But there is still catching up that needs to be done in that sense to represent Native art in our museum collections. So our goal really was to present Native art as fundamental to our heritage, to our cultural heritage. The core collection was based on aesthetic merit. As I tried to explain. We wanted to present a comprehensive range of Native art from across the continent, as I say, from pre-contact to contemporary and everything in between. And the final plan that we developed was for 3 galleries, 6,100 square feet, organized around 8 culture areas with just under 210 objects representing 65 different nations. And that was the basis of it. And also at this time, the contemporary collection was I was just beginning to build it. So the text panels that you see, we moved those to include contemporary Native peoples, but I think those need to be looked at again and maybe tweaked with a greater emphasis. I'm not certain. I want to look at them again in that way. But the galleries themselves, from the outset, were conceived as an object-centered installation. And so many Native American installations, I think, drop back to a certain set of cliches that, again, come out of the natural history paradigm where you're presenting culture, you're presenting history. I wanted something that was extremely neutral as a backdrop. I wanted the works to speak for themselves. I wanted a seamless integration of architecture, casework, color, lighting, all intended to highlight the objects and focus the viewer on the works of art. In other words, there are no overt cultural references that you would see. We didn't go through and paint the Woodlands area green and the plains yellow and so forth and so on. The only reference to the natural world is in the floor. And if you've taken any time to look at that limestone, you will see fossils that show up here and there. So it's sort of an ancient component in this very, very modern space that was inspired, I think, by a cross between the Field Museum, those big open glass cases, and the first exhibition of Native American art as art, which occurred at the Museum of Modern Art in 1941. If you've ever looked at any photographs of that installation, it was incredibly contemporary and beautiful. But what we wanted most of all was a contemplative space, something that would really immediately establish a reverential tone. We wanted that kind of experience for the viewer because it's appropriate to the Native art. I would say that almost everything that you see in those galleries is religious art, either by direct association or indirect association in terms of function, content, form, materials, all of it. So someone mentioned to me not too long ago that there was a period of time here where spirituality was discouraged as a point of discussion in your work. Is that true? Yeah. It would be, to me, it would be like trying to talk about European medieval art and not mention Christianity. I mean, it is a bit of a distortion. So, and I think you can go too far the other way as well, but certainly an awareness that this is religious art in almost every fundamental way is an important underpinning to what you present, and we wanted the gallery to express that. And it's interesting, it's the Native American visitors that we have, that I've had the privilege of taking through, they over and over again, they say, this is such a respectful installation. And it's interesting that they chose that word, and I think part of it might have to do with the lighting and the kind of contemplative atmosphere that we've tried to create. But most of all, when we were heading into the planning for this installation, I go back to a phrase that the critic Michael Kimmelman brought forward when he was talking about the new installation at Musée de Quai-Branly. The title of the piece was Heart of Darkness in the City of Light. I recommend it. I'll forward it to you. It's really kind of a terrific piece. He takes Quai-Branly apart, and he really elevates the installation of tribal arts from around the world in the Louvre. And he basically says the art at the Louvre, each object is given the dignity of its own space. So I was working with an incredible young designer with these galleries. Rebecca Young was her name. We started out working with a very, very high-powered Washington firm. We worked with them for 6 months. They just didn't get it. And at that point, Mark Wilson said, we're going to do this ourselves. And he turned the project over to Rebecca. And she was amazing. And if you look at the casework, you know, there will be 3 objects maybe in a case, or 5, but there could be 5 or 7 or 8. And she always was right there holding me back so that we were presenting fewer objects in a more direct, profound, and focused way. And I think that that's really important. That's an important feature to our galleries. The director from the St. Louis Art Museum came, I don't know, I gave him a tour a few years ago, and he said, I've never seen a tribal gallery except the Louvre where you have given so much space to the number of works that you have on view. And I think, again, it's a respectful thing to do. We come out of a natural history paradigm where you basically jammed as many objects into a case as you possibly could. Excuse me. It's that transition to this weather. Anyway, that was the philosophical basis of the galleries. That's how they were planned. We worked with a firm in Milan, Gopian, which was the best case maker, in my view, in the world. We visited 6 different case makers. I think 2 of them were in the US, 2 were in Germany, 1 was in England, and then there was Gopian in Milan. And the design department told me that they really settled on Gopian because they thought he would be the best, because he's one of the most innovative and experimental of any case maker in the world. Later on, they told me that he was the only case maker that would take this design and actually try to execute it, because we didn't know if it would work. If you think about those pieces of glass, I think there's one that's 10 by 13 feet. It weighs about 2,000 pounds. And then the question is, how do you get into the case? And of course, they open like doors. I mean, it's a fabulous installation, and it did all work. Rebecca was the one that designed the galleries. I've never worked with a designer that was quite so much in my head as we moved through things. She really understood what I wanted and then was able to take it a step further. So it was a wonderful collaboration. What we wanted too in these galleries was a visual permeability. At the very outset, you know, we have a map, and like all maps of culture areas, it looks like there's a rigid boundary between those areas, and for most of them, there really are not. A lot of the Plains Indian peoples, as you know, migrated out of the woodlands in response to opportunities created by the horse, but also pressure from Euro-American expansion to the east. So really, the woodlands merges into plains, which you can see in our galleries. And at the end of the plains, you see Apache, you see Navajo weavings, because the plains people were trading with those peoples and interacting with them. You walk through the door, and to the southwest is our Southwest Galleries. The plateau is right in between, and then the Northwest Coast Galleries are to the northwest. So these galleries, I don't know that we planned them this way, but they basically are a highly abstract representation of the North American continent and the culture areas. But it's easy to walk through them. One of the first Native Americans that came through these galleries, she said, what I love is that, she was Osage, by the way, from Oklahoma, And she said, wherever I stand in these galleries, no matter what culture area I'm standing in, I'm looking into at least one other culture area. She said, there is such a sense of interconnectedness here. Because Native American cultures are so amazingly diverse in cultural patterns, in language, histories. I mean, there are tremendous differences that separate these peoples, and yet there are certain overarching worldview, overarching qualities that really link all Native American peoples. And we wanted these galleries to suggest that in their physical form. The one thing that was really missing in these galleries, and it says something about where I was 9 years ago, is that there is basically no native voice. It's what you see on the walls, on the text panels, on the labels, is basically a curatorial voice. I worked with really a wonderful educator, Denny McHenry, who was extremely rigorous, and I was told she was tough to deal with, but really good. And we were still speaking at the end of it, and she was really good and brought a lot to those labels. I've had young people, some of my interns, at a certain point I'll say, what do you think of the American Indian labels? And they say, well, they're really good, but they're too long. And I'm going to want to hear from you what you think about that. The label copy that we did for the Plains Indians, if you remember, was much shorter. Each label was roughly 80 words, and the text panels were broken down into a curatorial voice, mine, a historian, Colin Galloway, and a Native American artist or museum curator. And so that there were three different points of view talking about the different periods of time in Plains Indian art and culture over, many millennia. So, and I think that we've taken that a step further at the Metropolitan. As I mentioned earlier, I will share the text panels that we created there. I'm not certain that they're entirely successful because we were trying to be so succinct and brief, but I think they really do they make a statement. So, what I'd like to do now, we've been at it for just about an hour. Shall we take a 5-minute break? 5-minute break, and then let's come back and at this point, let's kind of focus on any questions that you may have around everything that I've just talked about. So let's take a 10-minute break. Sure. Sure. Okay. Yeah. If you can't hear me, raise your hand. No, make a fuss. Fusses are good. Okay. 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 All right. I didn't take a count, but it looks like most of you came back, which is nice. It's always a good sign. Now, I've had two people say to me that they couldn't hear me very well. Does that mean that everything I've just been telling you, nobody heard? I mean, but if I'm either blasting you out or if you can't hear, please let me know. Someone said I didn't want to cause a ruckus, and I thought that's what you people do. So this might be a good stopping point just to kind of address any questions that you might have regarding anything I've said or anything else. I mean, you know, from this point we'll start to look at some objects and talk more about things. But you know, let's yes. Yeah, the question was, who was the guy that, did you say gave us? No, I may have said gave, but he sold us. Yeah. Have you ever seen a picture of George High? He was the founder of the Museum of the American Indian High Foundation, which was a private museum. It was at 155th Street and Broadway originally, and that is the collection that ultimately became the National Museum of the American Indians collection. So George High was, he assembled the largest collection ever made. I can't tell you, the numbers vary, but well over 1 million objects. It's the greatest collection in the world, I would say. Without doubt, and he was a businessman. He was tough. You know, I can imagine what the transactions were. The sale that he made to the Nelson Atkins was the first major sale that the old High Foundation made out of its holdings, and we got 100 things from him. How we got 5 great things, I just can't imagine, but we did. So,
could you spell his last name for us?
Heye, George High.
Greg in the back?
Yeah, my question is more personal. Where did your original interest and appreciation for Native American art come from?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, where did my interest in American Indian art originally come from? You really want to know that? Well, first of all, a lot of good luck. I think most of us, if we look back to what we do that is very meaningful for us, we can think about moments that were really critical, that brought us to where we are, and a lot of them are by sheer chance. And and that was the case with me. I'm of a generation that was fascinated by cowboys and Indians, and so that was there. You know, some of my earliest childhood drawings, which I still exist, were of Indians. So there was an interest, you know, as a small child. And this is going to be succinct. You know, it's not going to, so don't worry. I'll try to make it. And, you know, so I grew up with an interest. I grew up in a small town in Illinois that looked like a Walt Disney set of a Midwestern town. It was a brick-lined streets and overarching elm trees and about 30,000 people. And because of my interest, my parents decided to take me to Chicago to the Field Museum of Natural History, which at that time was the largest permanent installation of Native American works in the world. Later on, as a professor, I taught a survey. I took a class in for a week and taught a survey of American Indian art, just simply using what was in the collection on view. Everything was there. I think there were something like 90 fully dressed mannequins. I mean, the installation was enormous. And looking back and kind of understanding things, I think it was the first great aesthetic experience that I'd ever had, in that I saw things that I'd never seen before. I saw beauty that I'd never seen. My parents told me later that I cried when we had to go. For an 8-year-old boy, that's pretty pathetic. But anyway, so that was important. And then as I went on, I kind of lost interest, and that got transplanted by things that are less, adolescence and all what we deal with there. But when I got out of high school, I was lucky enough to get a job with the Forest Service in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. So I left Illinois and I got on a train, and the further west I got, this was a long time ago because I'm pretty old, the smaller the train got, and landed in Sheridan, Wyoming. I think there was I don't think that town had changed much since about 1910. And of course, it was right in the heart of the Powder River country, which was the last great buffalo range. It was rich in history. The Plains peoples that held out the longest, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, specifically also the Arapaho, that was their last great range. And so when there was a Denver and a Salt Lake City and a Bismarck, North Dakota, and an Omaha and a Kansas City, basically all of those great cities, there was nothing in the Powder River country but buffalo and Plains Indians. And so working there immersed me in the history and Plains culture. And then I came back to undergraduate school to try to become an artist. I wanted to be an artist and a professor. You could not take American Indian art history. It didn't exist at that time. In fact, I was one of the first professors to begin teaching a survey course in Native American art back in the mid-'70s, and did that as long as I was at Drake University until I came here in 2002. So but during my undergraduate years, I sort of did what you do, I think, in a number of ways. I simply developed a course of reading for myself. And so while I was studying to become an artist and going through, a university education, I was also on the side reading everything I could about plains and woodlands, Indian culture and history, and really immersing myself in that without any real intention to ever do anything with it, except that I was deeply interested. And when I finished graduate school, I read I basically exhausted a lot of the literature, and I thought, it would be very, very interesting to go see the art that Native peoples produced in a kind of focused way. And I no better place to go than back to the Field Museum, which is what I did. And I was simply smitten again with what I saw. The installation had not changed since I was 8 years old. So it's kind of, what they do in natural history museums. It changed not too long afterwards. And then and this might be of interest to you, I then decided that, so I came to Drake University as a teacher in drawing and painting, and I headed the studio drawing program. That's what my work was, and I was beginning to develop my career as an artist. But I also learned after my first trip to the Field Museum and inquiring around, because I didn't know, that 90% or more of all of the great North American Indian art was kept in storages, mostly in natural history museums throughout North America. And I was stunned by this. And this was a very different time. This was 1975. And I decided that I was going to embark upon a survey of American Indian collections throughout the country for no other reason than to see the great works of art, because most of them were not on view. And so I called the Field Museum. Now you have to think about this. I said, hello, I did have some credentials. I'm a professor at Drake University. I'd like to look at your tobacco bags and crow shields, and I'd like to come and study the collection because I'd like to create a course in American Indian art. And they said, how long would you like to come? I said, 6 weeks. They said, okay. It was a different time. And after the first day, when they knew that I knew how to handle things and that I would put them back where I found them, they simply turned me loose in storage for 6 weeks. And that followed with basically every major collection in the country: the Smithsonian, the American Museum of Natural History, Peabody Harvard, Denver Art Museum, Milwaukee Public, all the great collections and secondary collections. Over a period of about 8 years, I went through them. And when I did my first major project, the person who was with me, who I took on my research visits for that, when we finished, he was looking at a big book written by Norman Fetter in the late 1960s. And he said, my God, he said, I'm looking through this and I realize that I have held in my hands almost every one of these pieces. And that is the way it was. So I spent basically 8 years photographing objects, looking at objects, admittedly with a concentration on plains, woodlands, prairie, to a degree Pueblo. There were some things that I didn't look at very much, like painted robes or Navajo weavings, because it took a long time to get them unrolled and to roll them back up. Which sounds funny, but I was moving through. I figure in that 8 years, I probably spent about 2.5 years in museum storages. And so it was a wonderful opportunity. And I came to kind of a crossroads in 1984. I had a sabbatical coming up. By that time, I had a gallery in New York and Chicago, and I was trying to make my way like many young artists do. And I had to decide if I was going to spend the sabbatical in my studio or doing research. And I decided that I would do the research. And Drake University was just at the right size. In other words, not the University of Iowa and not Grinnell College, that my administration allowed me to continue heading a studio drawing program, but to turn my work towards Native American art history. And about that time came opportunities to begin some lecturing, some curating of small shows, and then in 1984, I had the opportunity, I was invited to curate the Art of the Meskwaki, which was incredibly important because all of my work up to that point had been in museum storages, museum collections, historical objects, just me looking at objects and talking about them with other people, mostly collectors and dealers. And, you know, it always alarms me when I get a text. Just, anyway, what that project did was bring me into a living Native American community, the Meskwaki of Iowa. And if you know much about the Meskwaki or anything about them, you know that they have a remarkable history. They were pushed out of Iowa. Most of them were pushed out, some hid out. But the majority of the tribe left Iowa in 1846, and they were in eastern Kansas for about 10 years. And then one of the leaders had a vision of returning to Iowa, and the short story is that the tribe sold everything they could, including 300 horses. They convinced the governor of Iowa to, and this does have a point, they convinced the governor of Iowa to buy land as their guardian because Native Americans were prohibited from owning land at that time. So in 1856-57, the tribe moved back to 80 acres of land on the Iowa River. They constructed a traditional village, and they continued through the 19th century and into the 20th century with their language, with their sacred bundles, with their religion intact, with their social structure, their clan structure. And because of that time, they were probably the most studied Algonquian group because their culture was sort of pure at that point. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had no control over them. So they couldn't demand a census. They couldn't demand education in schools. Missionaries had no luck whatsoever. And the Meskwaki moved into the 20th century very much as a highly traditional conservative group. And when I began my work with them in 1984, after about the first year, I found myself most closely associated with the hardcore traditional people within the community. And the plan was to do an exhibition at the University of Iowa of 200 years of Meskwaki art, and from 1780 to 1980. And I worked on that for 5 years. I continued going to the settlement for 10 years. But the reason that this is so important is that it totally transformed my understanding of the continuum of Native art. And I can't tell you how much I learned in working within that community. I also had really the great privilege of, I would say, building trust within the conservative community. So I was invited to ceremonies, which at that time was no non-natives were invited. And so I had that experience. I had great support and I'm mentioning this because that has given me a different set of credentials in going forward in the work that I've done subsequently. When I would go to other Native American communities or talk with elders from if I mentioned that I was with the Meskwaki community, it held a lot of weight because that community was known for its adherence to tradition. Not the entire community. Like many Native American communities, it was pretty much split down the middle, very much like our nation as a whole. But the group that I was with was, they were known pretty much throughout the country. Someone was doing a book at the time on the state of Native American religion. I think this was in the 1970s or 80s, probably the 70s. And he found that there were only two communities in the country where he was not particularly welcome, and that was the Meskwaki community and the Taos people in New Mexico, who are also known as being, strong traditionalists. So I had the great good fortune of working with those people and seeing historical things through the eyes of contemporary Native peoples, and understanding that some things continued to hold great meaning, other things did not. It also brought me into the lightning rod of American Indian art. When we opened the installation at the Metropolitan in October, a lady with a Native American organization came out with a statement, a press statement saying, this is not art, it should not be in a museum. These things were looted from graves. I mean, it was a very, very provocative statement. And I think that is it's part of the political landscape that one deals with in Native American art, and in presenting it and in talking about it. So, that time on the Meskwaki settlement was incredibly important. And then I followed that with an exhibition and a book on the Native American parfleche, which are painted rawhide containers, almost purely historical things, but it was the work with contemporary artists that helped frame my vision, my understanding of those historical things. It was really transformative. And then I had a chance, I was invited by the Peabody Museum at Harvard to really look hard at the collection of Lewis and Clark objects. It was the first analysis that had been done in 100 years. And I worked for 4 years on that project, and during that time I came to the Nelson Atkins. And since here, I've been able to do the galleries. I was invited to guest curate the Plains Indians just at the time that Julian arrived, which was a very nice connection. I think that our connections made with Musée de Quai sort of were the underpinnings for the Picasso exhibition that followed, and then this recent thing at the Met, and now working on the catalog. So there you have it. It's the whole thing. And I'm sorry to lay all of this on you, but I am not on Facebook. I am not, this is really my opportunity. So, okay. Yes? What? Miss Bodenson is my neighbor, and I have to watch what I say. We still speak occasionally, but did I cry the second time? No, but I will say that I have been terribly moved on occasion by confronting works. And it doesn't limit itself to Native American works, but I think the best answer to the question is that there are times when I would find myself going through a storage collection in a very, I'll say, categorical way. In other words, I'm looking at crow shields, and the different designs, the construction, trying to date them. In other words, looking at them very much like an art historian. And then there will come those moments when you pick up a work of art and you are inexplicably smitten with the persona of the maker, the person that made it, the person that owned it, the history that the object reveals. I was having a conversation recently about a collector who was a good friend with another person that knew him, and he said, Larry was never interested in how things were when they were made. He was interested in what they had become through their life. And I think I mention all of this because that is never too far away in my looking and thinking about things, you know. But yeah, I don't weep easily or regularly, but I do. Yeah. I was once in the Wheelwright Museum that was having an exhibition of Maria Martinez pottery, and the family arrived to look at the exhibition, and they were beautifully regaled, and I found that very moving. Again, I mean, in the end, we're always brought back to the human quality and the human spirit, and the way that the human spirit manifests itself in creating works of art, and the way humans, you know, bring works of art into their own existence. I mean, it's sometimes said that Native Americans had no word for art, and I see that's in the tour, but that's one of the things I'm going to recommend that we get rid of, because I think even to say that is, unless you follow it up with a paragraph, it's a bit of a distortion. Native Americans, they didn't have a word for art because they didn't need to. The creation of works was so infused within the community that there was simply, art didn't exist as a separate class outside of life. It was all there at the beginning. So. What else? Yes? Yeah. Yes, the question was, when we opened our galleries here, did we bring in someone to bless the gallery, bless the objects, and bless the people that had handled all of the objects? And the answer to that is yes, we did. There are various protocols in different museums, depending on the part of the country that you're in, and what sort of the constituency of Native American peoples in the area. But again, going back to the Meskwaki and asking at the time what they felt was appropriate to do, we finished the installation like at 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon or whenever it was. And the opening was the first opening, the first entry into the gallery was the next day. And I found, I started to inquire, and I found a man, Andy Yellowhair is his name. He's a Southern Arapaho Sundance priest. He works at Haskell. He's head of the grounds department. But I was also told that he helps students a lot that are having difficulty with being away from home and having difficulty with spiritual issues, that sort of thing, ghosts in the room. And so I went out to Haskell to meet him, and I asked him if he would feel comfortable blessing not only Arapaho objects, but the objects from not only Plains tribes, but Inuit peoples and Northwest Coast peoples and Pueblo peoples and all of that. And he said yes, he feels comfortable doing it, feels that it's appropriate to do, and was willing to put himself in a position of blessing, in a sense, cultures outside of his own. So we finished the installation late in the afternoon, and Mr. Yellowhair and his assistant arrived, I think, at 5 o'clock, and he blessed we simply sat to the side while he and his assistant went through and they call it smoked, but they dropped tobacco onto a small fire with the smoke and an eagle wing fan. They went through and they covered all of the cases, just as though if you were in a ceremony, they might cover you. And the entire, I think it took, an hour, I don't know, they went through the entire gallery very thoroughly. And then they blessed each one of us, Andy, because we were the ones that were handling this material, sometimes without any depth of knowledge, and in accordance with the native belief that some of these things remain dangerous and they cannot be handled lightly. And so this was, in a sense, a blessing, a kind of protective thing. And the assistant for this project was about to have a baby any moment. I remember that. I think she waited until the day after the opening. I was forever grateful, Kelly. And so a special blessing was performed for her and her child that would be coming. And it was all very lovely, and we finished that and then moved on with the series of openings. If you were here for the opening of Plains Indians, we had a number of blessings there. We included in that exhibition was a ghost dance dress, and the French don't care about any of this stuff, so nothing happened over in Paris. But when the crates arrived here, when we opened the crate for the ghost dance dress, again, Mr. Yellowhair was here it was an Arapaho dress, and he was here to bless the object and bless those that were handling it. And then he was part of the blessing for the opening of the exhibition. We had other blessings as well from local community members. I think there were 4 or 5 different blessings that occurred. When Andy Yellowhair blessed the galleries for the first time, he also went down and blessed Roselle Court, because that's where the dancing would occur and the flag ceremony would occur and all of that. So he covered all the space as well as the objects and the people. And I've had people say, do you really need to do this? And I think we do. I think it's important to respect those protocols. Not every Native American person would necessarily expect it, but there are certainly many that do. And again, it's a respectful thing to do. I'm never far away from recognizing that I'm not Native American, that most of us that are talking about their works are not Native. We are outside the culture. I think the primary goal is of an installation like we have here or a special exhibition is to honor Native peoples and make them feel good about what they see in the galleries and something that they can bring their children to and point with great pride that this is their heritage and the heritage of other Native peoples. So I think a blessing is part of that. When we opened in New York, we did something interesting. We invited Native American leaders from around the country. I think there were 20, 25 of them. And we brought them to the Metropolitan, and we opened the gallery to those Native leaders first. They were the first ones to go through the exhibition and basically see the installation. And then it was open to a select number of non-natives from that point. And then there was a blessing that was given by a local Delaware man, and Manhattan used to be Delaware country. We posted a sign, basically signage in the gallery saying that This land was originally Delaware land. We might want to think about doing something similar here, although this was kind of a contested property. Not only Kansas and Missouri, but before that, the Osage, the Sauk and Meskwaki, the Kansa. This was kind of a crossroads in some ways. And then the public opening that we did, or it wasn't the public, it was the next opening the following evening. We also did a blessing there. And I would say that was more, not so much to bless the galleries or the people that had worked on it, but to communicate something to New York visitors who might not be so attuned to what's going on in a space like this. And so it was a way to communicate that these galleries were fundamentally religious, that the art was fundamentally religious and spiritual. What else can I? Yes. I think that would be lovely to begin your tour by reminding people that the land that this museum sits on was, at least over the last 200 years, traditionally Osage land. And before that, I don't know that, actually I don't know if the Kansa and the Osage fought. They might have allied to a degree, but to simply remind these young people, and adults as well, that people were here before we were, and Native peoples were here before we were. I think it would be a great thing. We'll work on that. We crafted the statement for the Metropolitan, working with the Delaware group, and came up with something that I think is very appropriate and very nice. The question there was, should it be at the entrance to the gallery, which is where it is, or should it be at the entrance at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is where it's not? So, I mean, we're still trying to work all of this stuff out. Yes?
I may have stuff you were talking about, I don't know what exactly happened, but you were talking about one Native American had expressed concern that perhaps maybe some graves had been desecrated or something, or it was taken from, you know, graves and you know, whatnot. And actually, I know, I've heard a lot of questions like that in other museums. So, I mean, I'm assuming that, you know, we went through whatever we had to go through to make sure that everything we have is appropriate for display. But what's the best way to answer that question if we have it?
It's a big question, and an important one. The question is basically, how do we know provenance in terms of where objects come from? I think the things that I hear most commonly from Native peoples questioning Native art in museums is, should it even be in a museum? Because it was, now I'm talking about historical things. Should it be in a museum? These objects were never created with the intention of being in a museum. Were they taken from Native peoples under duress? In other words, were they stolen? Were they, was advantage taken of Native peoples who needed money and had to sell things? Were things looted from graves? Those are the questions. And the other question, and it's a big one, should all of this material be given back? You know, what about repatriation? And those are very large questions, and The answers are complicated. One of the reasons that I love Kevin Gover's initial quote that led this off was that we have a complicated history. It's not black and white. And I would say that there were things taken in battle, in conflict. There are things in museums that were taken from graves inappropriately. There were certainly things that were purchased from Native peoples under duress. And at the same time, there is an enormous amount of material that was made for sale to non-Indians, even in the 19th and late 18th century. There were many Native families who had acculturated to a point that the old things didn't mean as much to them. They were happy to sell them. There were many things that were made explicitly for trade or were traded to non-Indians. And there were many things that were gifted to non-Indians, missionaries, teachers, military men, friendships, ranchers, neighbors. So it's a larger story in that sense. And you can't make, in my view, any kind of declarative statement that all of this stuff was taken away from Native peoples. The idea of giving it back, the first question is, give it back to who? You know, what things should be given back? That's where the NAGPRA, the National Repatriation Act, falls into place. There are certain categories of things. It's not an easily written, or it's not I think it's not a well-written law. There are a lot of gray areas around it. Room for discussion. The best thing about NAGPRA is that it has established, I think, real communication between Native communities and museums. And that was something that really needed to occur, and I think it's occurred and it's growing, and it's important. There's another thing that is coming very much, I think, into the forefront over the last 20 years is that oral history, historically, Native American history was an oral tradition. And that tradition is still in place, and there is still information that is sometimes given by Native peoples that illuminates our understanding of what an object was, what it was made for, how it was used, that sort of thing. Trying to think if there is something. I would say also that on the other side of that, day before yesterday, I was speaking to an artist who's a Kiowa woman, and she was co-curator for an exhibition that's going to be opening in early June at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and it's basically Native art created by Native women, historical through contemporary. And she said the most difficult thing for her was to speak for other. She says, I really can't speak for other tribes. I really can't speak. She pointed to a Navajo lady in the booth next to her, and she says, I don't know what those people, I don't know anything about those people. And that does really, it goes back to the diversity of Native cultures. There are plenty of Native Americans that are certainly willing to speak for all Native American peoples, and this is a very non-traditional approach to things, but it's part of the current landscape, political landscape. It's simply a part of things. It's complicated, it's complex. One of the reasons that provenance is so difficult to trace, unlike European art or American art, is that nobody considered most of this material to be art. It wasn't considered valuable or important enough to really record who owned it. So a lot of material is still coming out of private collections. There were lots of private collections, from a few objects to several hundred objects that have been created over the last 150 years. The natural history museums were going through communities trying to preserve what they thought was a dying culture. So it's, you know, as Kevin Gover says, it's a complicated history. It really, there's kind of no easy, there's no silver bullet, as George Horsecapture used to say, in terms of understanding this. You really have to kind of look at it on a case-by-case basis. Yes? I'm sorry?
What are your thoughts on our current collection? If 10 were perfection where you want it to be, where are we currently?
I heard, what do I think about the current collection, but what?
If 10 is exactly where you would want it to be, contain the items and the diversity that you wanted it to have, where are we today? On a scale of 1 to 10.
Oh, okay, on a 1 to 10. Oh, I see. Okay, it took me a while. So where is the collection today in terms of 1 to 10? In terms of historical and modern works, I think we have some extraordinary things, and I think it's a strong representation of historical Native American art. There are a few types of objects that we do not have in the collection. For instance, a Navajo serape from the 1840 to 1860 period that would be extraordinary to have. I had one on loan here for a year and a half, but they're enormously expensive. I mean, I've still got my list of things that I would like to bring in, but I'm looking more right now at contemporary works and how to sustain the presence of contemporary Native artists in the collection. And that in itself is becoming more complicated, but of course, because it interfaces with our Department of Contemporary Art. You know, I mean, if, again, you go through Reclaim, those are all objects that I brought in pretty much in the last 3 years. There are prints, there are photographs, there are paintings, and there are also Native artists that are working in installation, in video, in basically all the mainstream forms of art. And when those galleries upstairs were conceived, basically the collection was, the galleries were really intended to present a historical body of works interspersed with contemporary things. Because frankly, when I came, the divisions between departments was very strong. You know, there was modern and contemporary, there was photography, there was American, there was, well, the exhibition upstairs I collaborated with Stephanie Knapp on. And as curators, we're looking for more opportunities to really collaborate in those ways. Julian is far more open in his views as to the permeability of departments. So when I came forward and said, I want to buy a photograph, he said, that's great, you know. It would be nice if you let your colleagues in photography know what you're doing as a courtesy, but if you found a work that you feel is important to the collection and can justify it, you should buy it. And so things are opening up, but with that, there is the fact that there is not a single Native American work in our contemporary gallery. So there's more work to do in terms of bringing Native American art forward and expanding the collection. And then there's, you know, there's also where is, if you notice in my galleries, they were not conceived to hang paintings, prints, drawings, things on the wall. So where are those things going to reside? Perhaps in American, perhaps in contemporary. There's a whole nother genre of Native American art that we have not collected, which are paintings that were done basically in the, I'll call it the Indian school style, from around 1920 to the 1980s, 90s. How many of you saw the article in KC Studio on Bruce Hartman's collection recently? That material. And so there are enormous opportunities for collecting in that area. And Bruce Hartman began probably 8 years ago with a very specific focus on that, building his private collection of these things. And he will end up with a very important collection. It's already important, that will undoubtedly go to an institution at some point. But we have not collected in those areas. Okay. Yes?
Which pieces in our collection do you consider to be the masterpieces and why?
Which things do I consider to be the masterpieces and why? We'll look at some of those. And, but the broad answer to that is that, you know, when I came as curator, the first thing I did was assess the collection. And by assess, I mean, you can be very, you know, it's a very logical thing to do. You look, for instance, you look at the art of the subarctic peoples and what are the major forms that were created? And do we have any? And if we don't, where are they? Where can we possibly find one? Do I have? One of the advantages that the Nelson had when I came was the fact that I was old, and I also was well acquainted with the market, you know, many dealers, and a lot of collectors throughout the country. And when I was an academic teaching Native American art history, I had a nice relationship with a lot of the major dealers. And the idea is that I would give them information very willingly if it could be helpful. And the trade-off is that I got to see some works that nobody else got to see. They came out of a private collection somewhere, and they were sold and went into a private collection. And I got to see a lot of that material. So where am I going with this? And also I think I would say that my background as an artist was fundamental to what I do as a curator, because when you're creating your own work, you know, you have an idea of what you want to do, but you're always asking yourself, did I achieve this? Could it be better? If I've done 10 drawings, which one most fully embodies the ideas that I was trying to bring forward? Not necessarily which one is technically the best, but in an overall sense. Well, I mean, that same kind of critical, it's non-natural history thinking, it's fine arts thinking. It's trying to decide that one set of snowshoes is better than another. Why? I mean, so there's, you know, you can look at the technical aspects of things, but you can also look at the integration of the entire work, the sculptural form, the painting that occurs upon it, its condition, all of those things. So, I mean, so you begin with looking at a collection, what you have and what you don't have, where possible things might be, if they're available. When I became curator, I called a lot of collectors and dealers and said, by the way, our relationship is going to just shift slightly. I'm going to be after you for gifts. And as I mentioned earlier, the support and generosity of collectors from around the country to the Nelson Atkins has been extraordinary, because they felt that what we were trying to do here in terms of bringing Native American art forward was really an important and critical thing. And so dealers gave gifts from their own collections. Many private collectors were incredibly generous, and we couldn't do what we've done without them. So the next question tied to that is, okay, who establishes the criteria? I've had people say to me, well, wait a minute, who are you to say that who are you to say that this Zuni pot is better than other Zuni pots? And what my best answer is that if you look at enough Zuni pots, you know, and you have whatever ability it takes, in looking at all of those works, you can begin to discern what those artists valued, what they were trying to achieve. So the analogy that I used to bring forward to students was that I think the Smithsonian has something like, I'm going to say 300 Zuni jars. And if you look through those 300 jars, you're going to find that the great majority of the women who made them were good practitioners. They knew how to make a functional water jar on a technical basis. They understood the vocabulary of Zuni painting from the particular period, the compositional structure, the motifs that were used. So, you know, they were capable of producing a functional form that also had appropriate thinness. They knew how to handle their slips that covered the jar. They knew how to paint reasonably well. They had a vocabulary of designs that they drew upon to create their compositional structures. They were artists that were all kind of following the rules, and they were good practitioners, just like in medieval times or early Renaissance times. You had a lot of artists that were painting the Madonna and Child. But then what is it about Raphael? You see one of those, and that sets a standard because there's a human and emotional resonance that factors into all of the things that underlie the creation of the work. And so going back to the Zuni jars, let's just say that 20% of them weren't very good. And I don't do math very well. I was going to say the other 90%, but that won't work. You know, but so the vast majority ranged from, you know, very nice to really nice. And then there was that 5 or 10, probably that 5, 6, 7% that just were so inspired. You know, first of all, technically, they would be beautifully orchestrated, you know, beautifully undertaken, thoroughly understood by the artist, but somehow infusing that work with the human spirit, an emotional resonance, beautiful design, that simply, in other words, was, you know, you have 5% of everybody that was working that were really extraordinary, inspired, brilliant artists, just like you would find in probably any culture producing works of art. So I think that that's what you try to bring to, at least in my case, in building a collection, is that, and it goes back to me talking to Mark Wilson, or talking to some of the dealers or some of the people that are expert in areas where I'm not. You know, if I buy a Navajo bracelet from 1920 and I'm talking to an expert about the piece, what do you think about it? Because I do consult with people. I would say to them, would this turn your head? You know, you go through, you've seen 1,500 Navajo bracelets from 1900 to 1930. Would this one really stop you in your tracks? Would it make you think about the whole tradition? Are there things there that you've never seen before? Are there things that you've seen before that are more beautifully orchestrated than any other that you've seen? And I mean, you try and work it out. You try and bring the greatest pieces forward that you possibly can. And, you know, going back to Mark, you don't need a lot of pieces to do that, you know. I'll tell you about a tour that I gave once that was a lot of fun. I can't remember how long I'd been here, but I got a call from a New York attorney who'd helped me with a repatriation issue. And he said, you know, I'm going to be in Kansas City on business. I've got 35 minutes, and I'm going to come to the museum, and could you show me around? And I thought, that's what a fabulous thing. And so I identified, I think it was maybe 8 things in the museum. You know, the Kuan Yin, the de Kooning, a Japanese screen I particularly love, our buffalo shield, you know, just about 8, Persephone. I just took him from one work to another, and of course he was looking at things along the way, but I'm convinced he will never forget the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, simply because he saw 6 or 8 great masterworks here. And that's basically, I think, what you want to do in building and showing a collection. You don't want to bring works forward that are average. That's my belief anyway. Now, there's an interesting difference that I've begun to discern between our culture and, I'll say, traditional Native American culture. And that is that everybody that is producing, whether they are a master or whether they are just beginning, I would say are equally honored by the society, by the community, in terms of their effort and their place in creating things that are meaningful. So when I went into the Meskwaki community, and I said, who's the best ribbon worker here? Everybody told me, you know, Ada Oldbear and Susie Powashik, no question. But then other people were mentioned too, and like, oh yeah, she's just been doing it for 2 years, but she's really coming along. And so, whereas we, I think, as a culture would tend to dismiss lesser works, traditional Native culture tends to support and honor those people that are creating, regardless of whether it's a masterpiece or not. That's just my view. But it's a good one. What else? Anything else right now? What time is it? You want another break? Oh, question. Yes, Alita.
Gaylord, you mentioned that you are an artist.
Yeah.
What is your medium?
I was a painter and a drawer. And so I worked primarily in oil, and I had a stint in watercolor, and then I worked a lot with graphite. Yeah. I miss making things.
Do you still have
I don't. I quit producing professionally in 1984, and I tried to kind of keep it up, but once I started writing, I simply let it go. And I drew a lot more on my students' works. So, and actually I think I became probably a better teacher of drawing once I stopped doing it myself in a funny way. And the thing is, it's like, as an artist, when I spent the entire day in the studio and didn't really accomplish anything, I always felt that somehow I had achieved something. And when I spend a day trying to write, and it doesn't work, I just feel stupid. So it's a different dynamic. But what struck me is there's really there's not that much difference between trying to create an image and trying to explain to somebody in writing why something is beautiful or great or important or what you feel about it. Yeah. Would you like to take a short break? Yes? No? What? Okay, we're fine. Yes?
My question is, I am torn with this idea of contemporary Native American art and/or artists. Some of the Native Americans are creating very contemporary art that if we did not know they were from Native American communities, we would not know. And at one time, there was concern that Native American artists within their communities were not learning the traditional ways of creating beautiful pieces that may be utilitarian or worn, sort of like that. So when you say contemporary, are you looking at all of that? Or contemporary artists who happen to be?
You've just embodied the dilemma and the confusion of the whole field. Did you all hear the question? Could you hear? Well, the question was, when I'm looking at contemporary art, does that include everything? From tradition-based art to those things that are totally mainstream, where if you saw them in a gallery, you would not necessarily know that the creator was Native American. And I think we're all trying to figure out what contemporary art means in a global sense, not just with Native American, but with Chinese, with every other nation, nationality, heritage, African. In Native American communities, societies, first, it's a social issue, it's a community issue, it's an artistic issue. There is a body of Native American artists that are, I will say, looking back at tradition and what they create in terms of their technique, their knowledge of forms, the meanings that are infused within the works, did I say the materials and techniques that they use, the stories that they embody, the content. And these are works that, you would look at this and you'd say this was done by a Native American artist. And then there are those artists that are sort of moving beyond that, but because of the imagery that you would see, even though they're working, say, in painting or sculpture, something like that, the subject matter is Native American based, Native American oriented. So, if you see an Allen Hauser, for instance, the marble sculpture that we have on view up in the gallery, if you saw that across the room, you'd tend to think that was Native American artist that did that, I think. The Shoes by Jamie Okuma. Yeah, because the designs are taken from plateau beadwork. But at the Herd Indian Market, I'll show you the next time we get together. She did a piece called Fright Night that was based on her love of Dracula films and horror stories in general, and the fact that her grandmother used to terrify her with Native American horror stories when she was growing up, although she says there were messages to be given in that. And it's basically kind of a clutch purse covered with spikes with a beaded image of this vampire out of Coppola's Dracula film that is terrifying. And with it is a little wallet with Hannibal Lecter beaded on the. It's an amazing thing, except the fact that it's made of beadwork you really would not know that it's a Native American work of art. And, but the technique would suggest that it might be. And then if you, I don't know if we have it in the library yet, but the show that was done at Crystal Bridges, there are works in there that I would not necessarily think of as Native American when I saw them. I would have to read something, I'd have to see a label. Tied to this is the fact that many, many Native American artists are of mixed heritage. And in fact, Reclaim is kind of dealing with that whole issue. And I think too that there's dilemma with some Native American artists, and I'm thinking of Wendy Red Star. We have her 4-part series that is hanging right now, but we also have a 9-part series of paintings, small paintings that depict Crow Indian clowns. That's a long tradition, but if you looked at that, I'm not sure. I think there are a couple of images that look kind of Native American, so you might know, but that's the only clue you would have. The point I'm trying to make is, Wendy, she would far rather be hanging in the American gallery or the contemporary gallery than she would be placed in a Native American gallery, because she's looking to move herself outside of the constrictions of Native American artists, and it's a difficult thing. And it's you go to something like the Hurd Indian Market and Fair, or which is the second most important. The first is Indian Market in Santa Fe, and you see a lot of artists whose production is geared towards collectors. It's geared towards that market. And there are critics that would say that that is also holding those artists in. That if they're thinking about Fritz Scholder, the Native American painter, that he began by painting landscapes, abstract landscapes, and then he hit it big in his depictions of Native American images, and he became, a superstar. And then there was a period in his work where he left that behind, and he was painting things that were based on Egyptian themes and things that were, there was a series about women. There was no reference to Native Americans in any way, and sales, I happen to know, went from way up here to zero. So his collector base expected him to be creating things that were associated with Native American culture and art. So I'm going on about this because I think it's good for you to know what contemporary Native artists are trying to navigate, what they're trying to do. And then you have a large group of artists like Cara Romero, for instance, who did the work upstairs called Naomi, that are, she's a highly sophisticated, worldly woman. She's been educated here and about. She's a photographer. She's a superb technician, all of that. But she has chosen themes that reinforce her Chemehuevi heritage and basically the kind of state of many Native American peoples in contemporary culture. And that is becoming, I would say that's a huge subject matter for many contemporary Native peoples. But the conflict that you mentioned in the question is very much part of the conversation right now on many levels. And, not only what is an American Indian work of art, but one could say even further, what is an Indian? And that is touched upon in Janet Berlow, Ruth Phillips' book, which is on the bibliography. Who is Native American? Who has, is it blood quantum? Is it being raised, on a reservation, in a traditional kind of milieu as opposed to being raised in New Jersey or San Francisco. You go to Haskell Native American University, and the idea of identity is very much in the forefront there, and not always in the most positive ways. So it's a social issue that extends into the artistic one as well. Yeah. Is this good? Is this valuable for you? Okay. Anything else? Okay. So, what is a masterwork? I've selected a group that I would consider to fall into that category, and I think in your packets you have the label copy. And with these labels, I would say that I try to compress, what is the object, who made it, why did they make it, when was it made, how was it made, and why is the one that you happen to see at the Nelson Atkins special? What makes it exceptional? And so these two blades that originally came from Bruce Hartman's father's collection fall within that category, first of all, based on their size alone. I mean, these things are each about 12 inches long. They're also incredibly thin. And the fact that they have survived, 2,500, 3,500 years without being broken. First of all, they weren't broken by compression in the soil, or they weren't broken by a plow, or they weren't broken by somebody dropping them, which has happened, makes them rare just based on their technical quality and their size alone. They're extraordinary in that sense. And anybody who is a collector or knowledgeable about pre-contact stone material, I can guarantee you they're kind of stopped in their tracks when they see these. Most of the Sedalia blades that you see are, well, I'd just say that a big one is generally 6 inches long. A really big one is 8 to 9 inches long, and there are only a few of those. So this pair, and they were found together, is really completely extraordinary in terms of size. And what they suggest is that these were ceremonial blades. They're too big to have functioned as dart points, on the edge of a javelin or a spear. They were clearly made for ceremonial purpose. And I think what is so important in these is that technically, these go far, far beyond what their functional necessity would require. And that, I think, is one of the hallmarks of great works of Native American art. If you consider it, everything that you're looking at in the galleries upstairs, in historical, certainly, it begins to change in the 20th century, but all of those things were functional in either a spiritual way or in a functional, a utilitarian way. But I think it's on a text panel. At the same time, these objects really conveyed the most important concepts forming a society. You could make that generalization. So these objects are based on functional form, but they go a step further. They take it further in that sense. And in that way, so basically, the maker of these, although he or she, and we don't know which for sure, certainly was a technical master, took it a step further, one step further, and those have survived. And they were, I think it's said in the label, they were found by a farmer plowing his fields with a mule. And I sort of thought that happened back in 1930. I got a call one day from a guy out of the blue, and he said, hi, he said, I just visited the Nelson, and you know, those two blades you've got on view? He said, I found those. And he sounded like he was younger than me. And I thought, oh, well, first of all, are they fake? Well, I knew they weren't. But I thought, this is a weird thing to reconcile. This guy sounds like he's in his 50s or 60, early 60s, but he said he found them. I said, tell me about this. He says, yeah, I can tell you the field they came out of. So I said, well, tell me. He said, well, my grandfather refused to give up his mules even when all the neighbors were plowing with tractors, and they all made fun of him. But he loved his mules, and he believed in tradition. And I used to sit on the back of the plow, facing backwards, and when he overturned some artifacts, I'd jump off the plow and grab them, and he would pick me up on his next run back. Perfect. He said, yeah. I said, of course, I'm a curator. I said, well, do you have anything else? He said, no. He said, with the exception of these that my grandfather kept, I sold everything else for candy money. I said, that's sweet. And I didn't tell him what these are worth. You know, I think it would have floored him. So anyway. We don't have a lot of arrowheads or spear points or anything like that in the collection. One just came into the collection that is much older. It's about 10,000 years old. It's from the Paleo-Indian tradition, probably from Nebraska, but it has something that these blades don't have, and that is the piece of stone that it's made from is unbelievably beautiful. So not only is it technically perfect, the artists that made it found this stone that is gray to pink to deep rose. It's mind-boggling. And chose that material, executed this perfect blade, and it's not as big. It's an average size, about like that. But again, there was an artistic vision in place that was directing this work. All Sedalia points are made out of a chalk-like, it looks like a chalk-like colored material, so there's no fancy stone involved, so here it has to do with just the scale of the objects. Any questions? This is also, in my view, a great masterwork. It's a bowl from the woodlands culture, almost certainly probably Algonquian. It was collected in Massachusetts. We don't know how old this bowl is. In my estimation, it hovers between the historical and the pre-contact or pre-encounter period. When I date this for the book, I'll probably say that it's 1700 or earlier. We just don't know. And I'm not going to have it, carbon testing the wood doesn't matter because we don't know how old the tree was when it was carved. But as you can see from the eroded rim, this bowl was used for generations, many, many generations. And of course, the eroded rim that you see is worn over and glossed. The patina is incredible. The remnants of paint that you see, it's very unusual. But mostly it's the incredible form of this image of this great Manitou, probably a thunderbird, rising up off the rim, like it's rising up at the rim of the world, is such a compelling and powerful statement, I think. With woodland peoples, nearly all religious ceremonies included a religious feast, and consecrated food was taken, and the utensils that were used for these ceremonies often had representations of spirit beings incorporated into their sculptural form. This is not the best photograph. We have better ones now. But the reduction of this form I mean, all you see here is a bump that kind of becomes this beak against this flat plane that looks like the flaring feathers of an eagle's head. And then, if you think about it, if you just extend the form a little bit further, if you go from the head to the rim, it's almost as though the wings of the bird encompass the bowl and create the form. There's also something else very beautiful in this to me, and that is that the man who made this, and he was a carver, it's of uniform thinness. It's extremely thin, probably 1/4 of an inch at the thickest. And if he would have so chosen, he could have made a perfectly round, symmetrical form. He chose to leave the natural shape of the burl from which it carved as an important part of the form. It's the finished form. Really, it's never far away from the sacredness of the wood, the sacredness of the tree, the process of the carving. I remember once thinking, I hope I have an opportunity to write it sometime, but after being in a ceremony where bowls like these were used, I remember thinking, I'll never look at a bowl again without thinking of the trees, and I can never look at trees without thinking of a bowl. And that's really, the form is that close in its conceptualization. Also, the scale is remarkable, and also the fact that the thing survived is remarkable. So if you start adding those things up, and whereas there are lots and lots, not lots, but there are a good many beautiful 19th century bowls in existence, one of this age is, it's one of a handful. There are a few in the Peabody Harvard Museum that would go back this far, maybe some other institutions, but certainly fewer than 6 or 8. So rare, beautiful, deeply meaningful. And for Native peoples who still practice traditional religion where implements like this are used, this is going to resonate with them in a way that's important. Any questions? This is one of the true masterworks in the collection. These are called tab bags because the 2 rectangular forms that you see dropping down at the bottom are 2 separate tabs. In other words, the zigzag, double zigzag line you see going up the middle really represents, it's a physical split in the bag. So the bag itself, and the top is folded over, drops down to the horizontal band, and then it drops down into the 2 tabs. And the thought behind this is that this may be a very, very highly abstracted representation of a thunderbird. It may possibly be a representation of an animal skin bag, but again, highly abstracted, but based on a form that is conceptually centered into its shape and in its creation. We don't know, I think there are 19 or 20 of these that are known. This is generally regarded as one of the 2 very best. It came out of a collection in England where a lot of early material falls. All of these pieces are thought to date from around 1790 to 1800 to 1810 at the latest. They've been attributed to different tribal groups, different nations. They've been attributed to different regions within the woodlands. But I what I come down to, and a few other scholars that have looked hard at these come down to, is that it probably comes from the Ohio region, the Ohio River Valley, from the late 1700s. All of these bags are essentially identical in their form, with the rounded top that folds over and the two tabs at the bottom, and with the iconography that is quill embroidered upon the surfaces. They're also embroidered on the front and the back, but there is always a dominant side, I would say, and that's what you see here. And what is so extraordinary about this piece is that it is truly, and this is said in the label, it's a cosmological diagram of the woodlands' worldview and religion. The horizontal, multicolored bar that you see represents the plane of the earth that humans and life forms exist upon. The lower two tabs represent the underworld, and two manitous or spirit beings, turtles, they represent the underwater creatures that are usually associated with the healing arts. They're also the underworld. Basically, all of the manitous are potentially dangerous, but they also bring great benefit to the humans as well, if they're approached properly. Up above are two thunderers, two thunderbirds, and you can see that they're different. Their general configuration is the same, but one of them has lines dropping down off the tail, and the other has kind of rounded forms. There isn't just one thunderbird in woodland iconography and religious belief. There's an entire, I will say, it's the word I want, family tree of thunderers. Each of them are associated with different powers, different levels of importance and hierarchy. And the differentiation that you see here, just in the form of those birds, is identifying two different thunderers. Up above, right at the top, with the head cut off, there is a bird in profile, another type of thunderer, and then two humans. And you can see their hearts outlined, just like the hearts of the thunderers below. And it's thought that these are probably human proteges of the thunderers, perhaps in the act of transformation, but certainly connected to the thunderers. And then all around the edge are zigzag lines, and up, the contours of the tabs, the diagonals on the tabs, and then these inverted curvature forms that look like they're echoing color. All of that are probably, almost certainly, abstract depictions of sacred power. And so what you see here is a universe, really, that's alive with spiritual power in every way. There is also a sense of, as I say, the world view. Native peoples, many native peoples on the plains and in the woodlands, some other regions as well, view the world, a construct of the world, as a horizontal plane with a world below, which is the nadir, a world above, which is the zenith, the sacred directions, the four sacred directions, and the point where all of those meet is within the human spirit, the human form. And so with Plains Indians peoples that also share that belief, it's wherever you go, you carry the center of the universe within you, the sacred center. And that's really what's shown so graphically on this bag, are all of the powers that inhabited the woodlands world and that were seen and communicated with native peoples from that period of time. It's an amazing thing. It's also in just unbelievable condition. The quills are barely faded. Again, it's 220 years old. It's fantastic. Fantastic that it exists. Yes?
The design below the humans up on that upper,
It's a,
did you say what that is?
it's a floral form. I'm glad you mentioned that. It's some kind of a floral or flower form, which is another dimension of spiritual power within the woodlands world. The traditional native peoples, the woodlands was their world, and so much came out of that in terms of how they created their homes, their medicines, what to eat. I mean, these things were all infused with sacred power as well. There was a question, yes?
We used to identify horns on the turtles. We used to identify horns on the turtles.
There are horns on the turtles, and I think it's a good generality that when you see horns on creatures that don't normally have horns, or sometimes that do, like buffalo, you're really looking at a depiction of a sacred being. So it isn't just a turtle, it's a turtle with sacred power, and that's what those horns are about. Sometimes on Plains Indians painting, you'll see horses that have horns on them, depicting a spirit horse. Any other questions? Do you talk about this piece with the fifth graders? Is there anything in your experience that they don't understand? Any other questions about it? Yes. Yeah, I mentioned the word transformation, which was probably misleading when you consider the concept of transformation in the Northwest Coast in the Arctic, where it was believed that humans had the ability to transform themselves into animals and the other way around. And it was an active sort of thing. The idea of transformation here would be I would say the absorption of sacred power, that it transformed, that act or that occurrence changed a person from somebody just out there walking around to someone who had knowledge and power, that would be important not only for the individual but also for the community. Yeah, yes.
When we had the opening day in the galleries and we had stations up there and there were a lot of Native Americans coming through, and this is related to horns, I was standing by the ferret.
Uh-huh.
And a gentleman came up who was obviously Native American and he wouldn't go past that. And I tried to engage him in talking about it, and he said, no, I'm afraid of it, I won't get any closer. And he sort of sidled behind and went as far as he could get to the ferret. And it was the horns that he indicated was bothering him.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised to hear that. One of the things that we tried to do that I think did not work was when we opened the galleries, we created audio guide, which I'm told that, this is interesting, I'm told that nobody uses it. When we did an assessment of audio guides in the museum, everybody used one for ancient art, and a lot of people used it for European, some used it for American, and then it dropped. Like 5% used the Native American in the American Indian galleries. And I've often wondered if just the whole sense of things in that gallery, you don't want to have someone talking at you. You'd rather take your time and just look or read. But the original plan was to have the art historical voice and also a Native American voice. And so as opportunity afforded itself, we began to record Native Americans. when they were in the museum. I mean, not just any Native American, but I mean, if we had a visiting artist or a visiting scholar for some reason, we would take the opportunity to record them. And one of the performers for the opening of the galleries, we recorded him in relation to that object. And he said, boy, he said, I came on that. He said, I didn't spend much time. He said, I simply dropped some tobacco, which would be a traditional blessing, and moved on. We have a lot of things in the gallery that are pretty high-powered things. And they're there. I mean, as I say, when I came to this installation, I had 10 years working with the Meskwaki behind me, which was enormously helpful. But I also do a lot of consulting with Native Americans from certain groups about, you know, should something be shown or not. Generally, where I come down is if an object was made for public display originally, then I'm inclined to display it in the museum. If things were made only to be seen by a select group, whatever that might be, then I would not put it on view. And then there are other things like Katsina masks that certainly are made for public performance, but the Hopis have made it, and the Zunis have made it very clear that they do not want masks on view because they don't want uninitiated children to see those things disembodied from their human counterpart, which does involve, again, spirit transformation. When you put the mask on with the proper ceremony, with the proper body paint, with the proper actions and protocol, basically your own self disappears and the spirit of the mask infuses you as a person. And in that moment, you become transformed for that ceremonial act. That's the concept. So these cultures don't want the mask separated from the ceremony to be shown. So there are lots of nuances in it, you know. But that, and you know, also my approach is to not ask a committee whether something should be shown or not. I try to go to the community, and if I don't know the community, then if I think it's okay to put on display, I do so, and then be ready and willing to take complaints very seriously. And if those occur, then consider removing the piece off view. But I can say in 9 years, I don't think we've had anyone, any Native American, really come forward and say that whatever we're showing shouldn't be shown. Yes?
Just one more question on the tag back. This is a terrific piece, and it's almost hidden the way it's in the gallery there. Is there any thought to giving this a little higher visibility in the gallery?
No. It's on its own. I mean, it's in its own case. And when we were developing the plan for the galleries, we wanted cases where interrelated groups of objects could be seen, either because they were related culturally. I mean, for instance, in the first case that you walk into, there's the Simon Chittimacha basket and a contemporary piece by Shane Goshorn. Same technique, basically, but a big span of time. So we wanted cases where things would basically play off each other, compound each other, increase the meaning of one another, and then objects that were selected to be shown alone, and that is one of those. And then there are also objects for pedestals where certain sight lines would be established to bring you through the gallery from one part to another to another. So I was also saying to someone, after 9 years, I remain incredibly pleased with those galleries, but the one thing that has really shown itself is that when we were planning those cases, we were also planning the compositions within them. And there's not a lot of flexibility. You can't just pull something out and put something in. Sometimes you really need to consider kind of reconfiguring the entire case. So, but no, it's the only other place where it would have more prominence, I suppose, would be where the wooden bowl is, in a pedestal in the center of the gallery. But if you do that, I don't want to show it flat, and I don't want to hang it. So it's got to be on a platform that has a back to it. So it's got to go up against a wall. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're very close. And I used to be able to lecture for 3 hours with no trouble whatsoever, but I'm finding I'm getting a little hoarse. So maybe this is a good point to stop, and we'll pick this up. But, okay, thank you. Meanwhile, think about everything that went on here today. Think about what you do. Think about situations that have left you feeling not as prepared as you wish you were. Questions that have come up from visitors, fifth graders or adults. All the things that we can, really kind of talk about in terms of what you do when you're up there in the gallery. And then we'll look at a number of other objects as well. Okay, thanks.